Module 3, Textbook Reading Assignment, Chapter 6 from AutoCAD Instructor, Basic Drawing Setup. Hi, Joe Cerrone. We're going to take a look at the textbook chapter for Basic Drawing Setup, and we'll take a look at how you set up a drawing to be able to draw. And essentially what they wanted to communicate to students is the proper units. We're going to use either a decimal or an architectural type of a unit. The limits aren't really that important as they used to be back when AutoCAD was first coming out. It just gives you an idea of the scope of the drawing or how big it is. Snap and grid, we've used those before. We just go ahead and set those up. And then working with layouts and setting up our drawing for proper scaling. And so when they look at the steps for basic drawing setup, they want us to check the units and the limits, the snap and the grid, and then as we go through and we work with these different drawings, they have these different startup options like using a template. And we do use templates quite a bit. We want the students to use the AutoCAD templates that we have, and so we can go out. The default is the acad.dwt template, and there's really nothing in it. Okay, and so if we were to go here into my AutoCAD, and then if I said File New, ACAD DWT Open, basically it's just a blank drawing. If I wanted to look at my format units, they're going to be set up in decimal, and that's about it. I'm not going to have any layers other than the default layer 0 for that. Anything as far as formats with drafting settings, I would need to set up as far as snap and grid. It's a blank document. And so we typically like to use the templates that we have included in D2L. And so as we work with the course, we'll be using like the plate title block template. And the templates are all located right here, all title blocks for CAD 116. And so if we wanted to take our plate title block template, we can download it and we can open that. And that plate title block is then set up for you. It's got the correct name of the company on it, it's got the title block, it's got an area for you to input the dates, and then it's got the layers that we're going to be using to create that geometry. And if we were to look at these different title blocks, we can then see that we have the metric, the MEC title block set up for decimal units. And so we'll use this drawing, and if I type in units, you'll see that it's set up for decimal units. And so we'll input our coordinates in feet and inches on that, in straight inches on that. And then if I was to look at the architectural title block, if we looked at the units for that, this one is going to be in architectural units, or the input is going to be in feet and inches like we talked about in Module 2, where you'll input your coordinates at things like 10 feet, 5 feet, etc. And so as we work with these different templates, we're going to tie those into our reading assignment here. And so this is what we're talking about in this chapter. As far as some of the settings, the textbook author likes to just go through, and he's very specific about how you would set up the units and the commands. This is kind of like having a dictionary for when you need to learn how to spell a word or something. You don't necessarily have to memorize these things, but it's a good way to look up some of the proper settings. Things like units, limits, snap, and grid, and then some of the default settings and some of the settings that they would have. So they're setting up the snap at a 1/2 inch for x-axis, 1/2 inch for y, same thing for grid. And then these line type scaling and dimension scalings get into how big the text will be. And so for these we'll just use our defaults, but that's what they're explaining here. And other things like hatch patterns and things like that, as we go and we do more drawings, we'll use those different settings. And then here they talk about the units command, like we just talked about, using decimal units. And then being able to look at things like direction control. We really don't change this in our CAD system. So this is just kind of tying in the coordinate system to the CAD system. And then when we work with limits, this is what we get our grid, and this is primarily with our architectural title block. So if I were to look at the architectural title block and I went to model space, the grid area right here is within the drawing limits. And so if I were to look at the limits, LIMITS, the lower left hand corner is 0, 0, and I hit enter. And then the upper right hand corner is 20 feet, comma 18 feet. And so if I were to turn on my snap, and then I were to analyze the top right hand corner by saying ID point, and I just came over to the top right hand corner, you can see it's 20 feet 0, and so that's 20 feet in the X and then 18 feet in the Y. And so it just gives you an idea if I was going to draw something like a garden shed or something on that, what I could draw on it. And it really is just graphical. If I wanted a bigger limits, I could say limits, leave the left at 0, 0, and then on the right I could say 24 feet, comma 24 feet, enter. And you'll see that the grid updates with the size, and that's because of my grid display settings. With grid display settings being set at 2, they'll show the grid display. If I were to set that to 1, then it becomes infinite and it's a moot point. It's not tied to the limits. So we'll set it back to 2 and continue our explanation for why things are the way they are in AutoCAD. And so limits is just a setting command. You don't need to memorize it, just know what it is. And then they have a lot of these different tips about creating things actual world size and what you see on the CAD versus what you see on the computer monitor. And what they recommend you do is to use what they call a zoom all command. When you zoom all, you basically make sure that you see everything within the drawing. And so oftentimes we'll open a drawing and we'll tell students zoom all just to make sure you can see everything. Here's our snap command. You can type in snap or SN or FN, and that will turn on and off the snap. And then you can also access the snap command in drafting settings. So when we look at a different drawing, like in our architectural drawing, if I typed in snap, I can go through and I can enable it, or I can check on the settings and things like that. I can also go up to my tools and drafting settings. It's a little more graphical here with my snap and grid and all the customized settings that I can work on for that. Alrighty, and then they go into a lot of detail about snap and grid and a lot of things that we don't really need to necessarily drill down into, but it's there if you're looking to go into customizing things. You can also turn on the snap down here at the bottom of the ribbon to be able to access some of those settings, as well as the grid. And so as we look at our AutoCAD and we were to pull up a drawing here, down here, here's our grid mode, so we can turn that grid mode off, and here's our snap mode. You can't really see the snap, it's just enabled or it's disabled. And then they go through a lot of things like settings and aspects that we don't necessarily need to get into at this point. Here we're talking about layouts and printing, and so as we work with layouts, those are actually frames for your drawings. That's where we have the title block information. And so you have a model tab down here, and then you have layouts. And the layouts are where we have the title blocks and things. And so as we go through and we work with what they call paper space, viewports, and these printable areas, we've already gone through and set those things up for you on our title blocks. And so as we go through and we look at the concept is that you create a drawing in model space, and then you flip over to layout mode, dial in the scale, and then you're able to go through with your drawing and frame it into a template. And so if we look at some of our drawings that we have already, and so if I were to look at this drawing right here, here we have our drawing template, and this is on our layout And so here's our layout for that. If I were to go into open, our architectural drawing, what we would see is that the model has the actual drawing in it, and then here's our tab for the layouts. And so we have a tab for the floor plan, and this is what's called a viewport. And in the viewport I can go and set the scale for that. And so this way, if somebody took a printed drawing down to the facilities department and they wanted to see if the drawing would fit into the room, and they can go through and they can measure the size of the door opening and things like that, because the idea is that we create the drawings in full size in model space. And so this is actually 16 feet real life units, and it'll give us that feedback right here in our CAD system. It says 16 feet there. And then when we set them up to be printed, we're working on paper, we need to be able to scale it to a measurable outcome, because we can't bring a 24-foot or 18 by 16 foot piece of paper in for real world size. What we do is we create a scale and then we measure that. And so by clicking in the viewport, you can go through and you can update the scale size. And so here I have it set at 3/8 equals a foot. If I dialed it down to 1/4 of an inch equals a foot, then we could measure that with a scale like from Amazon. And so when I talk about that, what I'd be talking about would be being able to measure the different sizes. And so that's part of the reason that we'll use layouts. And then as we go through and we print and plot these different drawings, it talks a little bit about printing and plotting. And so if I were in my CAD drawing here and I wanted to print it, what I would do is I would go to the printer icon right here, continue to plot a single sheet, and the book talks about default settings and things like that. But for example, if I wanted to print this to a PDF, I could say AutoCAD to PDF here. Let's go with a high quality. And then what it allows us to do is to set up our output device. And so our output device is a PDF printer right here. We could certainly set it up if you have a plotter to print to, like my brother, a multifunction plotter. I could set it to that to print that up. And if I were to set up to an actual printing device, then I get the paper sizes that are available for printing. And so I can say, okay, go ahead, print that, print it to a layout, and what we'll do is we will then preview it, and it'll show me what the drawing will look like when I print it. And then once I hit plot, I'll hit plot, it will send it to the plotter, and then it'll go ahead and print that. And so that's what they're talking about with that component. If I were to plot to a PDF, it would just save it as a file. And so when we look at some of the layout options, this is kind of an advanced function, but what they allow you to do is to set up the default. And so we could set it up so that it automatically prints to a PDF. And so when we go and we look at you would look at the plot and publish tab in the options. And so if I go into my drawing and then I right click and I go to options and I go to plot and publish, then right now my default is OneNote for Windows. But if I said, you know, I want this to be Microsoft Print to PDF, and apply and OK that, now when I go to print it, it's going to want to print it to a PDF by default. And so as we go into these, and I thought it would set it up, but it didn't. It still says none. So much for that textbook area. But you can dial it in just the same, AutoCAD PDF, set up what you want to print. And so they talk a little bit in some of the advanced chapters about what you want to print. When we're on layout mode, we'll select layout mode. We'll say OK. It'll ask me where do I want to send that file. I can just save it anywhere, and it'll plot it to a PDF and open that file. Alright, continuing. Alright, so it'll create automatic viewports and do some other aspects. And again, these are more advanced concepts. Again, under the options tab, If you're somebody who has sort of an engineering background and want to explore all the automated aspects of AutoCAD, you're welcome to it. You can select this create viewports and layouts, but it's really not necessary. And then as they talk about these chapter exercises, essentially they're talking about just basic drawing settings. Are you working with a metric? Are you working with a civil type drawing? And then they talk about which template you would use. And like Al and I have talked about, we're going to be using the templates for the specific drawing assignments from our D2L. Alrighty, that completes our lecture on Chapter 6. I will stop the recording and post it.